Is the United States moving toward a war with Iran?
That option remains on the table, according to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Here's what he said to CBS News yesterday.
The United States is considering a full range of options. We briefed the president a couple of times. We'll continue to keep him updated. We are confident that we can take a set of actions that can restore deterrence, which is our mission set.
The backdrop here is escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S., you will recall, withdrew from a nuclear agreement with Iran, which Iran has kept anyway up to now. But Iran has never had to stop all nuclear activity. And today, an Iranian official says that within 10 days, the country will exceed the amount of enriched uranium it is allowed to have on hand. That's as the U.S. continues to blame Iran for last week's attack on 2 oil tankers in the Persian Gulf region. All
right, a lot at stake here, and here to help us figure it out is NPR's national political correspondent, Mara Liasson. Hi, Mara.
Hi, Noel.
So there are, it's fair to say, mixed messages from President Trump and members of his administration, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And that announcement that Iran made today about increasing the amount of uranium it's processing is something that it said it would do since the U.S. pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal and imposed these crippling economic sanctions. But the U.S. policy of maximum pressure was supposed to push Iran to capitulate, come to the negotiating table for a different deal. But so far, it seems to be causing the opposite to happen. Iran is just getting more aggressive. So now the big question is, what does the U.S. do next? Because as you said, President Trump has been sending mixed messages. He says he doesn't want a war, he wants negotiations, but also that all options, including military ones, are on the table. And his hawkish advisors, including the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and his national security advisor, John Bolton, have been advocates for a much more aggressive confrontation with Iran.
I imagine what the Trump administration does next will, at least in some ways, be impacted by what our allies have to say about all of this. What are U.S. allies saying as tensions ratchet up?
Some allies are on board with the U.S., like the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Iran's age-old enemy in the region. They accept the U.S. version of events, but Germany has asked for more evidence. So has Japan, who owned one of the ships that were attacked. They're still asking for more evidence that the Iranian government was actually behind that attack. And interestingly, the Democratic chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, who accepts that Iran is behind the attack, blames the U.S. for squandering its credibility with its allies and for being finding itself in this isolated position now without all of the allies behind it.
But does that suggest that the U.S., the president, has lost credibility on the world stage? Or is this type of pushback normal, given the stakes here?
I think a certain amount of it is normal, but I also think that there is a lot of suspicion of President Trump because he has made so many statements that were inaccurate or misleading. I think that's part of the reason. There's also a lot of pushback because there's a suspicion among our allies that his top advisors do want a military confrontation with Iran.
And just briefly, what about on Capitol Hill? What are lawmakers saying about all of this?
I have been hearing some bipartisan frustration from lawmakers that the administration hasn't briefed them enough about the attacks soon enough with enough details. You're also hearing some calls, like from Republican Senator Tom Cotton, for a military response. So I think Congress is all over the place.
NPR's Mara Liasson. Thanks, Mara.
Thank you.
All right, in Hong Kong now, a second week of demonstrations.
Look on social media, you see amazing time-lapse photography of a particular street with people flowing down for hours. People demonstrated even though the government has slowed down an extradition bill with mainland China. According to protest organizers, some 2 million people took to the streets on Sunday. The bill at issue here is one that, according to critics, would allow Beijing to subject almost anybody accused of a crime in Hong Kong to mainland China's less transparent legal system. So why isn't suspending that enough?
NPR's Anthony Kuhn has been on the ground in Hong Kong. Hi, Anthony.
Hey, Noel.
All right, so these massive protests yesterday. What's happening today?
Well, they were massive, I can tell you that. I was trapped in this sea of humanity as it politely chanted and inched its way through Hong Kong's steel and glass canyons. And it went on all Sunday afternoon and for many people all night. A lot of folks went home to get some sleep. And then this afternoon, they started coming back. And we saw a few hundred protesters regrouping outside government offices and demanding a dialogue with the top leader, Carrie Lam. I don't think they got it, but basically I think at this point protesters and the government are looking for their next move.
You were out over the weekend. You were talking to protesters. What did they tell you?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, their demands are pretty clear. They want the bill scrapped, not paused. They want authorities to release the people who were detained for rioting. To give you an idea, I spoke to a ninth grade protester named Kelly Ip. She was there preparing for her Chinese history exam on Monday. She was there with half her class. And I asked her, if she felt threatened by this bill. And here's what she said. She says, I'm still not sure whether this bill would affect me when I become an adult, but at least I've fought against it, and we won't allow our freedom to slip out of our hands that easily.
Incredible words from a ninth grader. Wow.
That's right. And these protesters are also aware of what the Chinese government is saying, that the Western media and Western governments are stirring them up. And they're angry to hear that. They say, sorry, we're not brainwashed by anyone. We're doing this ourselves.
So if China is trying to crack down on Hong Kong's autonomy and the bill has now been delayed, what does it say that protesters have been able to pull this off? I mean, that seems like a real slap in the face to China.
Well, it really is against the odds if you think that Hong Kong has jailed protest leaders, they've banned pro-independence political parties, and disqualified opposition lawmakers. It's tough for people to speak out. So how are they able to, achieve so much with these protests? I think the most interesting explanation I've heard is that while Hong Kongers have never had direct democracy or direct elections for their leaders, they have had for a long time freedom of speech and the rule of law. And they know that when those things are threatened, you don't go quietly. You get on the streets and you talk about it.
And you said protesters regrouping today, even though much smaller numbers. What's next? What do you predict?
It's hard to know what the protesters can do. They want to press their advantage. They called a strike, but it's not really coming together. So it's hard to know what else they can do besides taking to the street.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn in Hong Kong. Thanks, Anthony.
Sure thing.
All right, an investigation is underway in Argentina to find out what caused a massive power outage yesterday.
Yeah, wow. Tens of millions of people woke on Sunday to find themselves in the middle of one of Latin America's worst ever blackouts. Argentinians are already enduring tough times. Their economy is in trouble, and a presidential election comes in October. Now people want to know what happened to crash the national power grid.
NPR's Philip Reeves is following this from Rio de Janeiro. Hey, Phil.
Hi.
So this sounds bad, if not disastrous. What do we know about what happened?
Well, it started around 7 in the morning, local time, and people woke up to find that the power was out, not only in their homes, but across almost all of the country, and also in parts of neighboring Uruguay and Paraguay, which get electricity from the Argentine grid. The impact, frankly, could have been worse on a working day, but, big power cuts are always very serious. The trains stopped running, water supplies were disrupted, so were phones and the internet. It happened on a day when there were some gubernatorial elections in some areas. These went ahead, but people had to use their cell phones to give themselves enough light to vote by. And it also happened on Father's Day, and a lot of Argentines were hoping to go out for Sunday lunch, but had to cancel because restaurants were shut. It took all day to get the lights back on. They are now back on, but people have a lot of questions.
Yeah, let's talk about the questions. Does anyone know anything yet about what caused this?
Well, so far we don't know a vast amount. I mean, officials described it as a failure in the grid's interconnection system that happened in the northeast between two electricity installations there, and then triggered this unprecedented, huge chain reaction. They're trying to figure out exactly why that happened. They have said, though, that they don't think that this was a cyber attack or any other kind of sabotage.
This, nevertheless, seems like the kind of thing that would freak people out. As you point out, it was on a weekend, so you don't have people trapped in elevators in office buildings or anything like that. But how are people reacting for the most part?
Well, they're clearly angry. They're already facing very hard times in Argentina. Inflation's among the highest in the world. They've got this boom and bust economy that's right now in such a mess that the government, very controversially, decided to sign on to a 56 billion IMF bailout. There have been regular strikes and protests. And right now, the political environment is particularly highly charged because presidential elections are coming up in October. President Mauricio Macri's fighting to keep his job in the face of a remarkable resurgence by the former president, Cristina Kirchner, who's running against him, this time on a ticket to be vice president, despite a stack of corruption charges against her.
So will this outage affect Macri's chances, or do you think everyone by October will pretty much have put this behind them?
Well, it doesn't do them any good. Argentines do care enormously about what the rest of the world thinks of them. We saw that recently, actually, when Macri hosted a G20 summit in Buenos Aires. This will impact their view of how the world views them. But Macri's I'm pretty sure he's going to blame Cristina Kirchner for failing to invest sufficiently in the infrastructure during her years in government.
And I imagine just briefly that an investigation into what happened and how to prevent it from happening again, especially on a weekday, will probably be conducted, yeah?
Yeah, they say they're going to conduct this investigation right away, obviously, and they estimate that it's going to last, it could be a couple of weeks before they get any results which actually clear this matter up. During that time, it's going to be a matter of big discussion in Argentina, we can be sure of that.
NPR's Philip Reeves in Rio. Thanks, Phil.
You're welcome.
If you accept their statements at face value, the United States and Iran agree.
Yeah, that's right. Iran says it doesn't want a war or a nuclear weapon. The U.S. says in return that Iran better not want those things. Morgan Ortagus is a State Department spokesman.
We continue to call on the Iranian regime not to obtain a nuclear weapon, to abide by their commitments to the international community.
But all those words come alongside certain actions. Iran says it plans to break one of the limits on nuclear activity that it agreed to in a deal in 2015. The United States withdrew from that deal but wants Iran to keep it, and now the U.S. is sending an additional 1,000 troops to the region.
NPR's Peter Kenyon has covered Iran for years. He's in Istanbul, and he's on the line. Hi there, Peter.
Hi, Steve.
So let's move through the way people around the world are viewing these actions. What do Middle Eastern nations, Iran's neighbors in effect, say about the U.S. moves first?
Well, the ones that are Washington's regional allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are fully on board with this pressure campaign, so sending more troops will be welcomed there. On the other hand, you've got a country like Iraq. It's got important trade links with Iran, electricity, things like that, so there'll be concern in Baghdad about the potential for these tensions to boil over to the point where Iran-Iraq trade suffers.
So some concern in some countries, and you say the potential for tensions to boil over. We should be clear about where we are. We have two countries that have pushed and pulled against each other before. They're doing that again. We don't know if it's heading for war, but they're warlike moves. What about reaction to Iran's announcement that it's going to go beyond the amount of enriched uranium it is supposed to have on hand?
Well, some see this as a fairly predictable response. Iran usually responds to pressure with defiant statements, even at significant economic cost. At the moment, Tehran remains a long way from having a nuclear weapon. That was the intent of the nuclear agreement, to keep Iran far from weapons capacity so that should it ever try to break out, as they say, and attain a weapon, the outside world would have plenty of time to step in. As for this announcement by Iran being potentially dangerous, certainly the main danger would seem to be to what's left of the nuclear deal.
And so let's talk about that deal and recall where we are. The United States withdrew from the deal. It says it wants maximum pressure on Iran to put some kind of more extreme limits on its nuclear program. European countries that were part of the deal have wanted to stay in. Where did these developments leave the Europeans?
In an increasingly difficult spot, I would say. None of the other signers of this deal, that's Britain, France, Germany, as well as Russia and China, none of them support this American pressure campaign. They think the deal was working. UN inspectors routinely verified Iran's compliance. Why go back to confrontation and uncertainty? A senior Chinese diplomat is warning against a Pandora's box about to be opened in the Middle East. But European efforts to save the deal have to have a mechanism, and so far that alternative payment scheme they've been working working on has not impressed Iranian officials so far.
Well,
and now, if Iran does breach the agreement, Steve, Europe will find it even tougher to save it.
Well, how much pain is this maximum pressure campaign causing inside Iran?
It's a bit of an opaque situation, as always there, but the economy is clearly suffering. Even Iran's elite Revolutionary Guard Corps, designated a terrorist group by Washington, is reportedly feeling some pain. President Rouhani today is repeating Iran's message that it doesn't intend to wage war with any nation, but he says we're facing a group of politicians with little experience. Meanwhile, the troop buildup and economic pressure continues.
Peter, thanks.
You're welcome, Steve.
That's NPR's Peter Kenyon. All right, last night, one of our correspondents swung by the site of a scheduled campaign rally.
Yeah, and she reports that people were camping outside waiting for the formal start of President Trump's re-election campaign. Now, this raises some questions, including a big one. Wasn't President Trump already running?
Yeah, let's ask NPR's Scott Detrow, who's here with a preview. Scott, good morning.
Good morning.
I thought the president had a campaign organization in place almost since the beginning of his term as president.
He actually filed for re-election on Inauguration Day. So This has been going on since the beginning. He's been raising a lot of money, been selling a lot of hats, and, of course, holding political rallies all across the country throughout his presidency. But after we've had 23 different Democratic candidate kickoffs, this is the formal, symbolic launch of President Trump's re-election campaign. He's doing it in a critical state, Florida. This is a state he narrowly won, and Republicans had two big wins there in 2018 in a year where Democrats won all over the country. So Republicans are feeling good about Florida. Of course, if a Democrat did compete and carry Florida, that would all but eliminate President Trump's path to a second term. So it's a big state, as it always is.
So we've had a couple of years to preview the campaign that formally begins today, as you point out. How different is the 2020 campaign likely to be for the president as opposed to his 2016 campaign?
Well, President Trump is still President Trump, and as he's changed course on so many things, his political approach to life has been very consistent since the beginning of his entry into politics. But under the hood, the organization of this campaign is completely different. Last time, for most of the race, it was really just President Trump and a handful of advisors and friends flying around on a plane. This time, it's an enormous infrastructure, raising a lot of money, doing a lot of data analysis and targeted voter outreach, working closely with the Republican National Committee. Those are all things that didn't really happen until the very final weeks or months of the 2016 campaign.
I'm also thinking about messaging. The president positioned himself as the outsider who was going to be independent and tear everything down in 2016. And now he's the insider.
Yeah. There are going to be two big themes of this campaign based on what we've been hearing so far and what President Trump has been talking about, again, in those rallies that have been happening all along. First is his economic track record. Unemployment at its lowest level in decades. The stock market is up, as he regularly reminds us. Consumer confidence is up. These are all things that historically, if they're all trending in that direction, a president makes it to a second term.
And we should point out, you can argue about how much credit a president deserves or this president deserves, but those things are real. The economy is doing very well, and by many measures anyway.
So that's the first focus. Of course, that's what the campaign wants to focus on. That was the plan in 2018 as well. And of course, President Trump in the final weeks of the race talked a lot about cultural issues, his hardline immigration policy. And
he changed the subject from the economy.
Yeah, and that really hurt Republicans in a lot of those swing districts in the House that they ended up losing. He's also going to go on the attack against Democrats, try to paint whoever the eventual nominee is as a socialist, as someone untenable. The idea is to really fire up his base and turn moderate and independent voters off from even considering voting for a Democrat. We've seen him go after Joe Biden a lot already, as well as a lot of other Democratic candidates.
That was part of his strategy in 2016, right? Saying Hillary Clinton is so awful, you can't possibly vote for her, and even though you don't like me, you have to vote for me. So that's going to be part of his case this time, you're saying.
And if you looked at the results a lot, there was less Democratic enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton than there had been in previous elections, whatever the cause for that was.
Scott, thanks for the preview.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Scott Detrow. All right, we know that migrants from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, Central America, have sought asylum in Mexico and the United States in growing numbers. And the number of migrants from Central Africa has also surged in recent months.
That's right. These are families and individuals, and they're fleeing political upheaval and violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Cameroon, in Angola, and more of them are coming, even though this is a journey that can take months and is very dangerous.
NPR international correspondent Carrie Kahn is in Mexico City and covering this story. Hi there, Carrie.
Hi, good morning.
I guess we should note it's not new that people come from Africa to Latin America and then try to reach the United States, but it's not something we normally think about. It's a little surprising when it comes back up into the news. What kind of numbers are we seeing here?
They're pretty incredible numbers. The U.S. Border Patrol says in just one sector of the border, the Del Rio portion, it's sort of west of San Antonio between Laredo and El Paso in South Texas. Since May 30th, they've detained more than 500 Africans. And in that time frame, there was a group of 100 that tried to cross, and that sounds similar to crossing trends we're seeing of Central Americans attempting to come into the U.S.
How are people getting from Africa to the U.S.-Mexico border?
Oh, my God, it's such a long, incredible, and for so many, harrowing journey. They are coming by boat and flights into South America, boats or flights into Brazil, into Ecuador, too, and then they start the trek northward through Colombia and into Panama. And, you know, that stretch of border between Colombia and Panama is the most treacherous. It's 100-plus mile stretch known as the Darien Gap, and there are no roads there, none.
Wow.
It is a mesh of mountains, jungles, swamps, and now it's rampant with drug traffickers, smugglers, and bands of robbers. And you talk to migrants who walk. They just walk that 100 miles, and they tell you of chilling, horrific stories of robberies, rapes, and people just dropping dead from pure exhaustion on that trip.
And
I've been on the Panama side of the border when people come out of the gap and their legs and feet are so swollen, bitten, bloody, and they're stressed, exhausted, and traumatized. And then, you know, you're just in Panama. You still have the whole swath of journey still in front of you.
That's the amazing part. And of course, they would already have crossed an ocean and several countries just to get to that horrible part and then have so much more to go. So why, from what you've heard, are they choosing to take that risk?
Well, it's unclear. Some experts are saying they think a crackdown in North Africa may have something to do with it, shifting the migrant trends. But, you know, this is, as you said, it's a well-worn path. And so it seems that these smuggling routes are working for them, and that's why they're coming now.
And so when our correspondents through the region have talked with some of these people, what have they heard?
Right. In southern Mexico, just over the border from Guatemala, there are hundreds of Africans held up in the border city of Tapachula, and many are just in desperate situation trying to get some sort of travel documents from Mexican officials or humanitarian visas. And our colleague who you spoke with last week, James Frederick, was just in Tapachula, and he met with many Africans. Here's this one 24-year-old man from Cameroon. He talked to Fortune Amore, who left Africa in 2017. He flew into Ecuador and started his journey. He said he fled his country after his parents were killed and harassment by authorities because he is gay.
I'm suffering a lot of my life, but I'm looking of my life. I need to go to good life.
It's a bit hard to hear him because he's in front of this immigration facility that's just jammed, packed with people. But he says he's suffered so much in his life, but he's confident God will help him get to the U.S. That's all he wants to do. He wants to get to the U.S. and apply for asylum.
I need to go to a good life, he says. Carrie, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Carrie Kahn.
The only thing these corrupt politicians will understand is an earthquake at the ballot box. That's what they will understand, and they're going to see it.
That's President Trump officially declaring the start of his re-election campaign during a rally in Orlando, Florida last night. He said a lot that's familiar. He promised to defeat the establishment. He took shots at the media. He aired grievances about the Mueller report, and he even provoked some chants of lock her up.
NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith was there at the rally, and she joins us now from the city of Orlando. Hi, Tam.
Hello.
So the president clearly sticking to messages that he knows are at least crowd pleasers at these kind of rallies, but it doesn't sound so forward-looking.
Yeah, I mean, even the soundtrack was the same as his 2016 campaign.
Oh, the literal soundtrack, the music that was playing.
Yes, no, that wasn't me speaking metaphorically. The music it was exactly the same. So were the arguments, most of the arguments. And, you know, he closed out the 2016 campaign talking about the system being rigged and saying the election could be stolen from him. And he kicked off his 2020 campaign with the very same themes. Now he's president, and he's saying that the other party is trying to erase people's votes.
Our radical Democrat opponents are driven by hatred, prejudice, and rage. They want to destroy you, and they want to destroy our country as we know it. Not acceptable. It's not going to happen.
So to put that into slogans, his argument was that he's made America great again. in 2.5 years. And now he is running to keep America great. But, the typical reelection message that focuses on accomplishments, it was there, but that's not where the passion was. The passion was when he was talking about grievances and fear and Hillary Clinton.
Right. So interesting. He says the Democrats are driven by hatred, prejudice, rage. Those are the same criticisms that are levied at him. And he does this often, takes the criticism and then flips it to his opponents. But I want to ask you, what does he mean when he says Democrats want to erase people's votes?
He seems to be talking about the Russia investigation, about Robert Mueller, and also the Democrats that are now investigating him in Congress, saying that they want a do-over by continuing to investigate him, and that that effort is an effort to erase people's votes. And it's something that resonates with folks that are there in the room.
What else did they tell you, those people there in the room, those Trump supporters?
One thing that was really interesting, both at this rally and I had been talking to some Trump supporters earlier in the week, was they kept talking about socialism. And that is something that President Trump mentioned in the State of the Union address and has continued to talk about and was a major focus of the speech last night. It is a way that he is drawing a contrast with Democrats, saying that they want socialism, he wants freedom. Vice President Mike Pence talked about it, too.
Which we should just say is not, well, go ahead, Tam. I think you were going to clarify that.
It's just worth saying that Democrats are not actually calling for America to be a socialist nation. They're talking about social programs.
Right, exactly. So the election is more than 500 days away. Are we going to see more of the same from the president?
Yeah, it's going to slowly, the rallies will sort of slowly ramp up, but just buckle in, guys.
NPR's Tamara Keith in Orlando, Florida. Thanks, Tam.
You're welcome.
So a lot of the president's appeal within his base has to do with his style, right? But the president's policy on immigration is also fundamental to his presidency.
And that may explain something that he tweeted on Monday. He announced an operation by Immigration and Customs Enforcement to round up and deport, unquote, millions of illegal aliens, unquote. He said this will start next week, but the logistics of this whole thing are very unclear because ICE officials are already really busy dealing with a growing number of people who are crossing the U.S. southern border.
NPR's Joel Rose reports on immigration and is here with us in the studio. Hi, Joel.
Hey.
Did we hear any more clarity from the president last night at this rally in Orlando where he launched his official re-election bid? Did he talk about this ICE operation?
No, nothing specific. On immigration, the president stayed on pretty familiar ground. He talked about the border wall, said that he would have 400 miles of border wall built by the end of next year, which is highly unlikely given the challenges that he's facing on that front, both in Congress and in the courts. There was nothing in the speech about this new enforcement operation that he mentioned, as you say, on Twitter. In reality, people who follow Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, think that there is just not enough capacity to deport millions of people, either in terms of ICE manpower or detention beds. And ICE, as you said, is already really stretched thin dealing with these huge numbers of migrants arriving at the border.
So, I mean, what details have you been able to learn about what the administration is planning and what's actually realistic here?
Well, the administration says it's planning a new enforcement blitz to apprehend migrants who've recently arrived in the U.S. and who already have a final order of removal from a judge. And that would include many of the migrant families that we've been talking about a lot because they're coming to the southern border in record numbers, mostly from Central America. This is a much smaller group than the millions that Trump tweeted about, right? Many of these migrant families already have final orders of removal because their cases were fast-tracked. And as for where this might be happening, the administration has been tracking migrant families in some of the nation's busiest immigration courts, Los Angeles, New York, Houston among them. And the number of migrant families we're talking about here is roughly 10,000, so not millions. Trump has repeatedly said this will begin next week, but it's really hard to predict the timing because ICE doesn't, usually announce its raids in advance.
So what are immigration advocates? What is their message to these people who are here illegally?
Well, on the one hand, they're planning for the worst. They're making sure that immigrant communities know their rights, are prepared if ICE agents knock on the door. But the advocates that I've talked to are also skeptical. They think a lot of this is political theater and that these mass deportations are not likely, at least not on the scale that the president has promised. Jess Morales-Riqueto is the co-chair of Families Belong Together, which advocates for immigrant rights.
It's a really disgusting political ploy. Everything he does is designed to stoke hate and rile up his base. And it may not be exactly like what Trump promised in his tweets, but it certainly does send shockwaves through immigrant and refugee communities.
So, maybe this is more of the same rhetoric that Trump has been using since he launched his campaign, his first campaign 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. Or it could be the beginning of a new phase in his crackdown. It's something, we'll be watching in the next few weeks.
All right, NPR's Joel Rose for us. Thanks, Joel.
You're welcome.
All right. Army Secretary Mark Esper is now acting Defense Secretary Mark Esper.
That's right. He's replacing Patrick Shanahan, who himself stepped in as acting Secretary of Defense after James Mattis resigned late last year. Shanahan resigned on Tuesday as details were surfacing of some turbulence in his personal life and what he described to the Washington Post as a family tragedy.
NPR's Tom Bowman covers the Pentagon and joins us now. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Rachel.
I mean, there's a lot of names we just listed off there. Mark Esper stepping in for Patrick Shanahan, who stepped in for James Mattis. This is not exactly a job where you want a revolving door. But just before we get to Mark Esper, can you explain what we know about why Shanahan is leaving?
Well, what Shanahan said is that he didn't want to relive a traumatic chapter in our family's life. He didn't want to dredge it through a confirmation hearing. And what happened basically is back in August of 2010, Shanahan had a very bitter argument with his wife, Kimberly, outside their home in Seattle. She called the police and claimed that he punched her in the stomach, an allegation he denies. And when police officers arrived, they found him with a bloody nose, scratches on his face, according to police records first reported by USA Today. Authorities charged his wife with domestic violence. Charges were later dropped, and then he filed for divorce.
So the man who is now to take over in this incredibly important cabinet position is Mark Esper. He's a familiar name at the Pentagon, right?
Oh, he is a familiar name. Army Secretary for, almost 2 years now. He's a 1986 West Point graduate, interestingly, the same class as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He served with the 101st Airborne in the First Gulf War, later worked on Capitol Hill and for the defense contractor Raytheon. And he's been cutting a lot of Army programs to switch to future needs like long-range artillery, electronic warfare, cyber. And he's also more recently been focusing on problems like Army housing. Rachel, you of course remember there was a kind of a scandal with decrepit, moldy housing back in the spring.
Right.
And I visited some of the housing at Fort Bragg, North Carolina with Esper. He told the families he was really sorry and they're going to fix it.
But who is he as a policy guy? I mean, is he the kind of person, especially in this moment with Iran, where there's all this tension and talk about a potential U.S. military intervention in some way? Is he the kind of guy who goes into President Trump, into the Oval Office and says, listen, President Trump, these are the real facts on the ground and they might not match up with what you think?
We don't know yet because he really hasn't been tested. As I've said, he's been focusing on Army programs, not these wider programs like Iran, North Korea, China, the future of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, let's say. And one of the problems with Patrick Shanahan was he wouldn't stand up to Trump, that he was a yes man, and very different from his predecessor, Jim Mattis, that he was... he had no problem standing up to Trump or anyone else on defense matters or other matters. So one of the questions, again, is going to be that will Esper be able to stand up, or will policy, as many people think today, is really being run by Secretary of State Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton? Again, Esper at this point seems to be clearly is untested.
And we still don't know if he's even going to get the permanent job, right?
Well, it seems that way. Trump has indicated that he will nominate him for the permanent job. And Esper starts as acting secretary on Monday.
NPR's Tom Bowman. Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome, Rachel.
We are in the middle of another tense moment between the U.S. and Iran.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard announced overnight that it has shot down a U.S. drone. A U.S. official has confirmed to NPR that the aircraft has been downed, but disputes Tehran's account of the facts.
NPR's Peter Kenyon is in Istanbul. He's been following this story. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Noel.
All right, so a lot remains to be seen, but what do we know so far?
Well, we know that an unmanned U.S. military drone has been taken down, and we know Iran was responsible. The report first came in from an Iranian news site that's linked to the Revolutionary Guard Corps. It was picked up by the state news agency. After an initial U.S. response that did not appear to confirm the downing, an American official does confirm to NPR and others that the drone was indeed shot down.
All right, but there is a dispute over where it was shot down, right? Iran says it shot down the drone over its airspace. The U.S. says it was over international waters. Why is this significant?
Well, I'll tell you why it's significant, because it's a question of whether this was a defensive move or not. This was the cause of some confusion early on after the initial Iranian reports, which said it happened inside Iranian airspace over southern Iran. The U.S. military's response was very narrow, said we didn't have any aircraft operating in Iranian airspace Wednesday. Then a bit later, officials began saying the shoot down did occur, but it was in international waters, and that would seem a move to undermine any effort by Iran to call this a matter of defensiveness.
Interesting. So once that is established, it could mean a lot. I mean, Peter, you've been on with us the past couple of weeks talking about this back and forth and how it's been escalating. And, the context is really important. How big is this development this morning?
Well, it's definitely big. How big depends probably on the U.S. response, first of all. It certainly could escalate the situation further. This was, on the one hand, an unmanned aircraft, a pilotless aircraft, I guess I should say. That's important because, as you know, the Trump administration has warned that the death of even a single American in this dispute could lead to a really strong response. So militarily, this hasn't altered the situation very much. But as an act of aggression, this could be seen in Washington as justifying a strong response. So in terms of ratcheting up tensions, this could be a lot more significant than the physical loss of one drone. There will likely be voices inside the administration saying this demands a response, and a lot could depend on what kind of response that turns out to be.
Peter, is there precedent for this? Has Iran shot down a U.S. drone ever before?
Several years ago, they were parading a drone that they claimed to have captured. There were some disputes about the circumstances. There were no huge escalations and tensions surrounding that.
So I know it is hard to predict, but what do you imagine happens next?
Well, the one thing we're not seeing in the immediate aftermath is cooler heads prevailing. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard is already saying, hey, we're sending a clear message to America. Commander Hussein Salami says they're not looking for war, but will react strongly against any aggression. And we should note this is different from previous incidents. This is a U.S. military aircraft, a direct attack, and that's why some will be calling for a response.
NPR's Peter Kenyon in Istanbul. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Noel.
All right. Joe Biden is in hot water yet again.
He intended to highlight his track record of working with lawmakers that he doesn't agree with. The problem is the example that Biden chose to cite. He recounted working with two senators who are known for supporting racist policies. Biden's 2020 Democratic rivals were quick to criticize. The presidential hopeful made the remarks at a New York City fundraiser Tuesday night. Since then, the former vice president has said he has nothing to apologize for.
NPR's political correspondent Scott Detrow is in studio with us. Good morning, Scott.
Hey, good morning.
So what did Joe Biden say exactly?
Yeah, so he was talking about how he's been criticized for trying to work with Republicans. So at this fundraiser, he talked about working with Mississippi Senator James Eastland, Georgia Senator Herman Talmadge, who were both Democrats, but they were both staunch segregationists. That's to say, they pushed for policies that kept people separated based on race and opposed things like civil rights legislation. So talking about Eastland in particular, Biden said, and here are the two quotes, "He never called me boy, he always called me son." And he went on to say, "At least there was some civility. We got things done. We didn't agree on much of anything, but we got things done." Eastland in particular was unapologetically racist. There are some shocking quotes from him during the Montgomery bus boycotts, talking about Martin Luther King and other marchers in very graphic terms, and talking about abolishing the African-American race as a whole.
Oh,
this was not nuanced
my goodness.
language.
So obviously here there is an opening for the other Democratic candidates to criticize Biden. What are they saying?
The criticism was pretty harsh and quick. New Jersey Senator Cory Booker came out with a strong strong statement saying you don't joke about calling black men boys. Vice President Biden's relationships with proud segregationists are not the model for how we make America a safer and more inclusive place for black people and for everyone. He called on Biden to apologize. Kamala Harris, another black candidate in the race, another U.S. senator, said this at the U.S. Capitol.
I have a great deal of respect for Vice President Biden, but to coddle the reputations of segregationists, of people who, if they had their way, I would literally not be standing here as a member of the United States Senate, is, I think, it's misinformed and it's wrong.
And as Rachel said there, Biden has not apologized or had not apologized. What is he saying to explain himself?
Yeah, he was at another fundraiser last night, and he said this.
There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career. Period.
And on top of that, he said that Cory Booker is the one who needs to apologize, which certainly surprised a lot of people hearing that comment. Biden supporters have been pointing out that he has repeatedly said the reason he decided to run in 2020 was President Trump's equivocating response on the violent Charlottesville white supremacist rally, that Biden has worked for civil rights legislation throughout his career, and among other things is very proud to have been Barack Obama's vice president. Jim Clyburn is the highest-ranking African-American lawmaker in the House, and he defended him as well yesterday. He told reporters, you don't have to agree with someone to work with them.
Okay, so we're entering a new phase of the 2020 presidential election. Debates start next week. Is this just what we should expect going forward?
Yeah, I think we were expecting already a lot of the other candidates to really start criticizing Joe Biden in particular on this debate stage. He has a wide lead in the polls, and he has this more moderate approach to governing than a lot of the rest of the field. So far, the criticism we're starting to hear has been implicit, talking generally about his policies, but not saying Joe Biden in particular. I think this moment really broke the dam, and a lot of candidates are saying Joe Biden is wrong, and we're going to expect to hear a lot more of that next week and going forward.
And Joe Biden, of course, been around a long time and has a lot of baggage. NPR's Scott Detrow. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you.
China's President Xi Jinping and North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un are holding 2 days of talks starting today.
And the location of these talks is significant. They're happening in Pyongyang, North Korea. It marks the first time in 14 years that a Chinese leader has made a state visit to North Korea. And the meeting comes little over a week before the G20 nations hold their summit in Osaka, Japan.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn is in Seoul, South Korea. Hi, Anthony.
Hey, Noelle.
All right, so why is President Xi going to North Korea? First time in 14 years for a Chinese leader.
Well, the official reason is that the two countries are going to mark the 70th anniversary of formal diplomatic relations between Beijing and Pyongyang. And that means you're going to hear a lot of talk about socialist solidarity between comrades, the ruling Communist Party of China and the Workers' Party of North Korea. Probably something about ties forged in blood in reference to the fact that they fought on the same side in the Korean War. But they also have not had a Chinese leader in Pyongyang for so long, mostly because of the nuclear dispute. But now look at the timing that you mentioned here. President Xi and President Trump spoke by phone this week. Then Xi and Trump are going to meet in Osaka, Japan, after with the Pyongyang meeting in between. So what's very likely, experts believe, is that Trump may have asked Xi by phone, get me some information on what Kim is thinking. And Xi may even deliver a message to Trump in Osaka. So this really puts, Xi Jinping as an interesting position as possibly a broker.
It certainly does. So if he played broker, what would that mean, for example, with the ongoing U.S.-China trade war?
Well, the U.S. has made it clear that cooperation on North Korea would help China on the trade war. And clearly the trade war is Xi Jinping's biggest headache right now. It's hurting the Chinese economy. And if there's no progress in talks in Osaka, then President Trump has threatened to hit just about all Chinese exports to the U.S. with tariffs, or at least those which have not been hit already.
Anthony, these summits are often aimed at telegraphing something to someone. If there is a message that this summit is sending to the U.S., what is that message?
Well, from Xi's point of view, he's sort of sending the message that he can make or break a deal between the U.S. and North Korea. He wrote in an op-ed piece in a North Korean newspaper that he wants to push talks forward. He can also turn Kim against Trump, which Trump has sort of suggested in tweets before. But she is sending a positive message this time. He doesn't need to send the spoiler message because everybody knows that. China can also do things such as sending a lot of tourists to North Korea or sending humanitarian food aid, both of which would help Kim, but would not violate any sanctions. Also, remember that Kim Jong-un has refused further summits for the moment with the U.S. and South Korea.
Yeah.
But Kim has met with China and Russia, so he's signaling there that he has other options. If things don't work out with the U.S., he has a fallback position, which is support from China and Russia.
And is this summit, just briefly, likely to be a very public one? Photographers, all of that?
Yes, there will be lots of pomp and ceremony, but there may also be a lot which is hidden and we don't find out about.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn in Seoul. Anthony, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
As of this moment when we're speaking, we know of no U.S. airstrikes on Iran.
That's despite numerous signs that strikes were coming. Some of President Trump's allies called for retaliation after Iran shot down a U.S. surveillance drone. The New York Times, the AP, and others report that the president actually approved a strike and then called it off. Several of the president's top advisors were said to be in favor of the strikes. Military officers were warning against unexpected side effects. Amid that debate, the president said yes, then no, but we don't know if that decision is final.
Now, NPR has not independently confirmed those reports at this time, but let's bring in NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe to talk through what we do know. Good morning.
Good morning.
Why, as best you can tell from the outside, did the president change course?
Well, based on these published reports, no one seems to really know or be clear on what actually prompted the president to pull back. It's just not known whether he just changed his mind or whether there was some other factor at play that kind of kept them from moving forward with these strikes. And I mean, as you said, it's also not clear whether these strikes could still happen or not. What's driving this, of course, is the downing of this U.S. surveillance drone by Iran, and Iran claims this was over Iranian airspace, but the U.S. says that's not true. They say the drone was flying over international airspace at the time.
Now, when we think about this reported decision that then changed, I think of William McRaven, who was on NPR News the other day talking about the decision-making process for national security crises and how it's a little bit less formal, to say the least, in the Trump White House. But we are left, Aisha, with the president's public statements about this, in which he hasn't really sounded that warlike.
No, well, so first he tweeted yesterday that Iran had made a very big mistake in shooting down the drone. Then he told reporters, you'll soon find out if the U.S. is planning to kind of respond in retaliation. But like you said, at the same time, he also said he thought Iran may not have shot down the missile or shot down the drone on purpose.
I find it hard to believe it was intentional, if you want to know the truth. I think that it could have been somebody who was loose and stupid that did it. But we'll be able to report back, and you'll understand exactly what happened. But it was a very foolish move. That I can tell you.
So it was kind of like this back and forth. I mean, Trump does seem to be pulled in opposite directions. Like he wants to show that he's tough, and he's certainly surrounded by some hawkish advisors. But he also campaigned on the idea of removing the U.S. from major conflicts in the Middle East, especially kind of costly military involvement, these never-ending wars. And he sees himself as a deal maker. But he has launched limited airstrikes before. You'll remember against Syria when they used chemical weapons.
Yeah, well, where's Congress in all this?
Well, so congressional leaders and key lawmakers were briefed by the administration and met with the president at the White House yesterday. And afterwards, there was agreement that Iran is a bad actor in the region, but not necessarily on how to respond. And so you had Democrats kind of saying they were concerned that the White House might bumble into war. And you had Republicans saying that at the time, that they thought the White House was engaged in a measured response to what was happening.
Okay, Aisha, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe. Now, the U.S. is, even if the airstrikes aren't going forward at the moment, the U.S. is taking other actions after the drone shooting.
Yeah, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, did issue an emergency order late last night. The order restricted flights over the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And all this, of course, is coming a day after Iran shot down this surveillance drone. And the issue is that Iran says that it shot it down over its sovereign airspace. The U.S. claims that the drone was over international waters. The dispute, the latest in a string of escalating provocations. Iran says it does not want war, though. Here's Iran's ambassador to the UN, Majid Revanchi.
What is in it for Iran to have a provocation? If, God forbid, a conflict erupts in our region, there is not going to be a loser or a winner. Everybody will lose.
Revanchi was speaking yesterday afternoon in an interview with NPR News. Let's talk this through now with NPR's Peter Kenyon, who's covered Iran for years, has closely followed the nuclear agreement and the aftermath. Hi there, Peter.
Hi, Steve.
How are Iranians responding to not only the U.S. accusations, but the reports of an airstrike that was called off?
Well, English language press TV carried a story that quoted the New York Times account of Trump's reported change of mind, but the versions have not included so far any reactions from Iranians, and otherwise the media has been very silent on the topic. It's possible Iran still expects the U.S. to make some kind of response, and it's waiting to see what that turns out to be.
Now, we are in a situation where it's he said, so to speak. It's one side with one version of events, the other side with another version of events. It's hard to verify what anyone says. But Iran is insisting it does have evidence. And the ambassador, Revanchi, in our interview yesterday, said that they actually recovered pieces of the drone that Iran shot down. Let's listen.
We have recovered some portions of the drone, which naturally fell down within the territorial waters of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Now, again, we haven't seen the pieces of a drone, but it does sound like Iran's trying to make the case that they weren't really engaging in a provocation here at all.
Well, yes, I'd say the plan at the moment from Iran seems to be defending that narrative that the U.S. drone crossed into Iranian airspace, and that's why it was shot down. I can't give you any expert opinion on how far pieces of a drone might fly after being hit by a surface-to-air missile, where the current might take those pieces. But I think there's certainly room to question whether just finding pieces of the drone in Iranian waters, if they did, necessarily proves it was shot down in Iranian airspace. It might not prove anything either way. I mean, this strategy by Iran is certainly also being pursued in other venues, too. The foreign minister says they're going to raise this stuff at the United Nations.
Okay, so you just hinted at one possible diplomatic avenue, or at least a place, a venue where people could raise diplomatic questions or push for some kind of diplomatic solution. But is it possible to see a route forward for these two countries when the United States is overtly putting what it calls maximum pressure on Iran?
Well, I think there's certainly people in both capitals who genuinely don't want to see a war break out right now. But if the question is how to get from this point to de-escalation without going through a war to get there, I mean, that's a big reversal that usually requires a willingness to negotiate and to be seen, perhaps, compromising with people you've got strong disagreements with. The Trump administration has said pressure is what works. That will bring Tehran back to the table. And that theory is what's being put to the test now.
And the Iranian response to that is we can't negotiate when you're putting so much pressure on us all the time. That's essentially what they're saying.
Under no circumstances. Yeah.
Peter, thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
NPR's Peter Kenyon. In the state of Alabama, Republican Roy Moore is making another run for the United States Senate.
Yeah, Moore lost to the Democrat in that race, Doug Jones, 2 years ago. The race was dominated by allegations of sexual misconduct against Moore. So now, Moore is giving it another shot. He announced his candidacy on Thursday in Montgomery, Alabama.
Which is where NPR's Debbie Elliott is. Debbie, good morning.
Good morning.
Why does Moore think he'd do any better the second time?
Well, he says he thinks he can win, and he claims he would have won last time if not for what he called false tactics used by Democratic operatives. Here's his confident statement yesterday.
Can I win? Yes, I can win. Not only can I, they know I can. That's why there's such opposition.
They being the Washington establishment that the conservative firebrand railed against during his last campaign. He also said he might change up his strategy a bit this time by making, quote, more personal contact with people.
Maybe not the most fortunate choice of phrase, given the allegations against Roy Moore. I do want to note, though, he won the Republican nomination last time, right? And then the surprise was that he managed to lose to a Democrat in a very, 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 very Republican state because of the allegations against him, which he still faces. So how is he addressing those allegations this time?
Well, he's still calling them false claims, and he says he doesn't think they will hurt him with Alabama voters who he says now can see the truth.
Okay, so what are Republicans going to do about this?
Well, after Moore announced, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was quick to tell reporters, we will be opposing Roy Moore vigorously. And even before he had launched this second bid, President Trump had discouraged his candidacy, tweeting that Roy Moore can't win and that the consequences will be devastating. You know, as you said, Republicans see an opportunity in deep red Alabama to win back this U.S. Senate seat that was formerly held by Jeff Sessions. And Moore is now a big complication for that.
Does Moore admit any merit to that argument?
You know, he does not, and that's not surprising. He's not dissuaded one bit. He's displaying the familiar defiance that has really defined his career. You know, we should remind our listeners that Moore was twice ousted as Alabama Chief Justice for defying federal courts. First over this giant Ten Commandments monument he put in the state judicial building, and then for rejecting the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling that legalized same-sex marriage. So defying the leadership of his party is nothing new for him. He did yesterday accuse national Republicans of launching a smear campaign against him.
What's the Democratic incumbent Doug Jones have to say about the possibility of eventually facing Roy Moore in a general election?
Well, I spoke with him by phone yesterday afternoon, and he stopped short of acknowledging that this is some kind of a gift should Moore win the Republican nomination. But he calls Moore an extremist of a different caliber. Here's what he said.
And the real issue now to me is who comes out. But we're either going to have an extremist like Roy Moore, or quite frankly, we're going to have an extremist that's going to be handpicked by Mitch McConnell.
Now, the scuttle in political circles in Montgomery suggests that Senator Shelby, Alabama's other senator, and some longtime Republicans are trying to convince former Attorney General Jeff Sessions to seek his old seat and just clear the field and solve this problem.
Well, you've got the beginning of quite a story there, Debbie. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
NPR's Debbie Elliott. Always appreciate her insights.